One of the things that's very important with the Saptamsha is predicting meeting times. When people meet to have a relationship. You might remember, those of you who took the Varshafala course, that in Varshafala we have Shahams, or parts that indicate particular events. And in Varshafala there's a Priti Shaham, which means the love Shaham, and the Vivaha Shaham, which is the marriage Shaham. And normally, a person meets somebody when the Priti Shaham is activated. Basically, they fall in love. And then later they marry when the Vivaha Shaham is activated. And in working with the birth charts, it's somewhat similar in that we need to look and see when they make a connection to someone, when they meet someone. And that is more often than not actually indicated in the Saptamsha chart, the 7th Varga chart, which revolves around the 7th house. Then when it comes to actually planning their life with the person and getting married with the person, then the Navamsha is the critical, important Varga, because that has to do with finding our ashram in life, whether it's marriage ashram or another type of ashram. So it's really important always, if you're trying to predict relationship activity, to look at the Saptamsha chart. The Saptamsha chart will indicate when people meet people. The Navamsha can too, so look there as well. But more often you'll find the Saptamsha is doing it. Okay? So it'll show when they meet people. It'll show when they're productive with their partner, meaning when they have a partnership that's actually producing something. And it'll show when the partnership is not working in cohesion and therefore not producing anything. Okay? So in this woman's chart, we're going to take a look at her sun first. We can see that her sun's exalted in the Saptamsha. And right away that lets us know that there could be some possibly important things happening in respect to relationship activity in the sun dasha. Anytime you have an exalted planet, chances are it's going to help some things in that Varga. Now, what is that sun going to help? Well, let's look at the houses it's aspecting. Okay, the sun is aspecting the first house to 42 points, one of the important houses. The 4th house to 18 points, one of the important houses, and the 7th house, the most important house, to 12 points. So it's aspecting all the important houses, most notably the ascendant, the most. Okay? Now, that means those houses are going to move forward during the sun dasha, which means the ascendant, which means she'll be more active in a relationship. Aspecting the 7th, she can have a more receptive partner that will work with her. And aspecting the 4th, there's room for the partnership to have a place in the world to produce and create. Okay? But the sun doesn't specifically rule any of those things. It's just given a favorable influence to those things. Okay? Now, in a good antardasha of something that rules the 7th house or rules the important points in the Saptamsha, they could possibly meet someone. But you really want your Mahadasha Lord, ideally, will rule something that's very relationship-centered. Okay? And that just makes it stronger. The Dasha Lord, when he's exalted or strong and influencing the right houses, can push things in that direction, but not nearly as nicely as when the planet rules that thing. And you see here, the sun doesn't rule the critical 7th house, doesn't rule any relationship factors in the Rashi chart. However, the sun in this chart is the Dara Karaka. So that's the Jaimini Karaka, which means in the Rashi chart, the sun is the planet with the least amount of degrees. It's sitting at 3 degrees and 48 minutes of its sign. That means that planet signifies the partner or the spouse and is an important planet to judge in the Saptamsha chart. And the dasha of the Dara Karaka, which is the producer of the spouse, can always indicate strong relationship activity. Okay? So the sun has a direct agenda over relationships in this chart. So the sun dasha can produce relationships. Now let's look at the sun. It looks like it's really wonderful at first, doesn't it? It's exalted. But if we look a little more closely, it's getting towards the end of Aries. And remember, when a planet starts getting towards the end of a sign in the Varga chart, it gets weaker. It's strongest in the beginning, weakest at the end. Okay? So, this means that the sun's not going to be as powerful as we thought he would be. Okay, as if he was more in the beginning. Jupiter, which is the karaka of the Saptamsha and also the karaka of the husband or the man, is also towards the end of Aries. Okay, so let's keep that sun position in mind. Even though it's exalted, it's getting towards the end of the sign. Okay, the sun. What planets are influencing the sun? First of all, in the Rashi chart, sun is alone. There's no planet joining him. Okay. Then, the sun's influenced by his friend moon, but the moon's debilitated, so he can't help. By Mars, his friend, but Mars is sleeping, so he can't help. By Jupiter, his friend, to a little bit, just 8 points. Okay? And again, because Jupiter's towards the end of the sign, he's going to give less. And in the Rashi chart, since Jupiter's at the very end of Libra, he's what we call Mrita Avashta, or dead Avashta, and very, very close to dead. So in any chart where Jupiter influences anything, he's going to only be able to help to a tiniest degree. Then we have strong Saturn influencing to 50 points. Saturn's exalted too, so he can really starve that sun. Not only that, Saturn's at the beginning of his sign in the Varga, which means he's strong, and the sun's at the end. Okay? Then in the Rashi chart, the sun is in the first 6 degrees of Aries, where it only gives a fraction of its strength, where Saturn's in the middle between 12 and 18 degrees of its sign, which puts it in the adult state. Again, you'll remember from the Lajitadi Avashtasa course, we kind of talked about that. And the Baba, maybe it was the Judging Baba's course, that's going to make it stronger. So even though they're both exalted and Saturn's aspect is not a full 60, because the sun has those other things, it's just not as strong. It's not as much of it there. Well, there's a lot of Saturn there. So the Saturn has the ability to actually completely starve the sun off, unfortunately. Okay? So that's going to reduce that ability of the sun to do well in the chart. Okay? Now, in Sun Venus, okay? But still, the sun is orientated towards relationships, but it's crippled, it's starved by Saturn still. So it's never going to indicate a great relationship. It's exalted, so it's going to have potentially great relationships. But Saturn's always going to cause something to go wrong. Saturn's always going to starve it anyway. Okay? Now in Sun Venus, we're saying in astrology that Sun Venus gives the full effects of the sun. It gives the best effects of the sun or the worst effects, depending on if the sun is good or bad. Now, that means right away Sun Venus will get you involved in relationships if the sun is relationship-centered. If, on the other hand, the sun is against relationships in your chart, Sun Venus ends your relationships. Okay? Now, in this chart, Venus, of course, is the karaka of relationships. The sun is the Dara karaka, the planet with least degrees in the Rashi chart. Venus rules the 7th house from the sun, which is the important house. So, in Sun Venus, they have a relationship, probably with the best person that they met throughout the entire Sun Dasha. Venus is in a friend sign, an actual friend sign. It's aspected by the moon, but the moon's debilitated, so he can't hurt him. By neutral Mars, by Jupiter, his neutral, and then by his exalted friend Saturn. So in Sun Venus, the person meets someone that they're so thrilled about, they actually start thinking marriage. Before that, they were really kind of not wanting to think that way in the other part of the Sun Dasha, because the Sun was just feeling so starved by Saturn. But then in Sun Venus, the Sun gets really prominent because Sun Venus really maximizes the Sun. Venus is the 7th from the Sun, which is the critical house in the Saptamsha. And Venus is very delighted in Saturn's sign and aspected by exalted friend Saturn. And actually in the Rashi chart, it's also with Mercury. So it also gets some delight from its friend Mercury. So, Venus is really, really happy to have this relationship in Sun-Venus. However, after the Sun-Venus dasha ends, and remember, the ending of a dasha, if it gives something, you can never quite count on it until you get anchored in the next dasha, unfortunately. Okay? So while Sun-Venus gave a relationship with a lot of potential, it wasn't shortly thereafter that they went into the Moon dasha. And the Moon is in really bad shape in the Saptamsha. It's completely debilitated. In the Rashi, it's conjunct Saturn, which means Saturn is going to starve that Moon. So the Moon is debilitated completely, and it's starved. And sure, it's aspected by the Sun a little bit, which is helping a bit. His friend Mars is sleeping, so he can't help. But he's helped by Jupiter as well. But still, it's debilitated and totally starved by Saturn. So as soon as Moon comes along, the relationship ends. And the partnership dissolves, and it ends up not going anywhere. Okay? Now, if Sun-Venus had been like in the middle of some dasha and it had some decent anterdashas after, the relationship could have lasted a lot longer. But the funny thing about Sun-Venus period is when it does give relationships, you can't really count on them until you go into Moon dasha. And if the Moon dasha is bad, then it's like in this case, then it's gonna fall apart. The normal rule for Sun-Venus dasha is that Sun-Venus dasha will ruin your relationship in most cases. Okay, it's very common. Because usually the Sun is not really in favor of a relationship. He's not a real social planet. In this chart, the Sun happened to be the Darakarka, so he was relationship-centered. But lots of times the Sun is not that relationship-centered. And in Sun-Venus, if there's afflictions to the Sun in the context of relationships tend to end. In this case, it was different. They were both relationship-centered. Venus was in really great shape in the Saptamsha, so one started. Because it's the end of the Sun dasha, what starts during that end is only going to continue good if the next dasha supports it. And in this case, it didn't. The Moon dasha didn't support it all. It's terrible in the Saptamsha. And it basically shows a lot of emotional grief as a result of relationships or Saptamsha activity and feeling very starved. And so that's what happened. In Moon dasha, relationship ends. Okay, sadly. Okay, this next person okay. I'll keep this Rashi up too here. We're going to look at this person's Moon dasha. Okay. The Moon dasha can always get a person married if it's in decent shape. The Moon is just really a social-centered planet. Okay. In this chart, the Moon is in a neutral sign in Sagittarius, in the Saptamsha. So the Moon can always get you relationship-centered, basically. Okay. The Moon's aspected by its Sun, who's strong in Leo, to 23 points. By his friend Mercury to 15 points. Neutral Mars and Jupiter. Neutral Venus and Saturn. Okay? So no afflictions to the Moon. It's a delighted Moon. This Moon gets more Saptamsha-centered simply because it's in the 10th sign from the Ascendant. Anytime you see a planet in the 10th sign from the Ascendant, and it's a planet that's good for that Varga, it's going to amplify that Varga more. Okay? And again, any planets and angles are always going to do better, but especially the 10th. Let's see. Okay, so the Moon, is decently relationship-centered because he's the Moon. He's not all about relationships, though. Okay? It's only because he's the moon, and the moon can get you involved in a relationship if he's in decent condition. And he is. You can see he's in nice condition here in the Saptamsha with no troubled aspects to him. He's in a good house too. Okay? But he's going to need the focus of a strong relationship-centered planet to really get a relationship going. If the moon ruled the 7th in the Saptamsha, or ruled Venus, or ruled Jupiter, or even ruled the 1st or 4th in the Saptamsha, then the moon would have a lot of focus on relationships. As it is, he's not all about focusing on the relationship, which means this moon, when the moon dasha starts, the person just doesn't think, I got to be in love, I got to have a relationship, I got to have a relationship. That's not what they're thinking. They're just going to be going around their lives, but open to a relationship if it comes up, which is the nature of the moon when the moon's in good condition in the Saptamsha and in a good house like it is. But they won't be all focused on making that the focal point of their life, because the moon doesn't rule relationship things like the 7th house, the 7th lord, or any of that stuff. The moon doesn't rule anything like that, and it's not the Dara Karaka either. So it's going to need a very focused planet to get a relationship going. Okay? Now, what is a possible really focused planet? Well, this person's Dara Karaka is the sun. Okay, so the sun again. And why did I look at the sun? Well, because the sun is strong. It's in Leo in the Saptamsha. It's also the planet helping the Dasha Lord Moon the most as his strong friend. Furthermore, in the Rashi chart, the sun is the 7th lord in the Rashi chart. So he has a social path. And then that sun is strong in the Saptamsha chart. That sun rules Jupiter, the most important planet in the Saptamsha chart. Jupiter also happens to be the Lagna lord in the Saptamsha, the lord of one of the important bhavas, and the 7th from the 7th. You can always get involved in a relationship in the dasha of the Lagna lord of the Saptamsha, or in the lord of that lord. Okay, in this case, sun is the lord of that lord. So the sun has three agendas for a relationship. It rules Jupiter, that's one, that's the man. It rules the Lagna lord, that's two. It's the 7th lord in the Rashi, and it is the Dara Karaka. So it's actually 4 reasons for the sun to throw them into a relationship. But is the sun good enough to do it? Well, the sun's in its own sign. He's in Leo, so he's strong. He's aspected by his friend Moon, by his strong friend Jupiter, who's in a natural neutral sign in Leo, his enemy Venus, but just to a little bit. Then the sun is conjunct Saturn, who's going to starve it. Saturn's in a natural friend sign in the in the Saptamsha, so he's sleepy, so he'll starve the sun to half his ability. And then Mercury is a neutral of the sun, so he's not going to help or hinder the sun. So the sun ends up being overall good. He's in its own sign. He gets hurt by Saturn, but helped by Jupiter, helped by the moon, hurt by Venus. It's equal, but he's in its own sign. So the sun comes out ahead, and he's such a relationship-centered planet. So in Moon, Sun, they meet their husband. Okay? The person they're eventually going to marry. That's when they fall in love. Now you see there's some problems here. The sun is in the 6th house. Okay? Not a great house. The sun is with Saturn. Sun or the 6th house and Saturn are delaying factors. When they went to Moon-Sun period, they fell in love with the guy. And they really, really liked the guy. But they didn't think that they liked him for months. And then they finally called me, and we were talking about it just casually. And I just told them not to give up on that person, because Venus would be crossing their ascendant in 3 weeks. Well, exactly 3 weeks later, when Venus crossed the ascendant, that triggered him to finally come up and introduce himself. Not introduce himself, but she already knew him, obviously, but to ask her out on a formal date. And at that point, they started dating and eventually got married. But there were still some delays in that, and it wasn't like she met him and he met her and they just wanted to be together and they knew they would be together and they went on a date within a week. It wasn't like that. It was a period of turmoil for the girl, wondering if he liked her. him being friendly and courteous, but not really making any effort to do anything with her, ask her out, get her phone number, or anything like that. So she really, really liked him at first sight, but didn't think he liked her. So it was a bit painful for her. So there was that delay she had to suffer through. Even though for her it was like love at first sight. But it didn't play out that way, because he had things he was taking care of that he wanted to get done with before he asked her out. So he was really being a gentleman. And once he felt he was ready to ask her out is when he did. So he always intended to, but he never revealed it to her for a while, until Venus crossed her ascendant. So you can see here, Moon can always get you centered in a relationship if it's decent. In this case, the Moon didn't actually have a specific 7th house relationship agenda, so it needed a really strong planet to do that with. And that strong planet was the Sun. Okay? It was also his friend, the Moon's friend, in helping the Moon the most. So in the Moon Dasha, which has relationship potential, the strong partner she meets was in Moon's Sun, because that Sun is that really great planet. What are other strong relationship-centered planets in this chart? Well, there's Mercury. Mercury is the 7th lord, but Mercury is in the 8th, sign from the ascendant. It's not totally reliable. Mercury is agitated by the Sun and starved by Saturn. It's a trashed Mercury. So you bet, in Moon Mercury, they had a very frustrating relationship. Okay? What's another possible planet? Well, Venus. Venus rules the 7th lord, Mercury. Venus is the Karaka of love. Venus is in the 10th sign from the ascendant. It's in a good house. Venus was, looking at where's its aspects. Okay, here they are. Venus, unfortunately, was just in a neutral sign. Then he gets starved by the Moon. He's neutral Mars and neutral Jupiter. So see, Venus is starved. So Moon Venus, they have a very disappointing relationship. They're starved in a relationship. And that relationship ended at the tail end of Moon Venus. And then in Moon Sun, they met the person they were going to marry. So you see, out of all the relationship-centered planets here, the best one is the Sun. So it's in the Sun that they meet the person that they are going to marry. Okay, that meet their strongest partner with the most potential. And then they go on to marry that person. So it's always good to look for that strongest one, because that strong planet is going to show when you're going to fall in love the most, when you're going to have the strongest feeling of bond with the person. And if you're lucky, then the Navamsha will kick in, so you'll be able to marry that person and keep that person before something else goes wrong. So it's not always the case that the best person you like the most and get along with the most is always going to be the person you marry. Like the previous example that I showed you, as soon as Sun Venus was over, Moon Dasha kicked in and everything just fell apart, unfortunately. Okay? Even though that was the strongest person she met for her during that entire Sun Dasha. But in this person, she was lucky that, Moon Sun did give the strongest partner. The other planets just were too messed up. Mercury was in bad shape. Venus was in bad shape. And so neither of those could give a satisfying relationship. But the Sun could. Okay? Okay, here's another one. Okay, this person met significant relationship in Saturn Dasha. Okay? Yeah, that was Saturn Dasha. Now, Saturn is conjunct Mars. So that's always going to mean Saturn Dasha is going to be somewhat frustrating. Okay? Fortunately, in the Saptamsha, Saturn's in great shape. He's really almost one of the strongest planets in the Saptamsha. Actually, there's lots of strong planets. There's Saturn, Venus, and Jupiter. So Saturn's in its Mula Trikona. Saturn is not really a relationship-centered planet in general, right? However, in this chart, Saturn luckily rules the 4th Bhavakas, which is one of the important bhavas in the Saptamsha. It's the place in life that you're given because of your relationship with the person. So indirectly, Saturn, if it's ruling the fourth in the Saptamsha and it's strong, can give a relationship. Okay? Now Saturn is conjunct to Mars, so Mars is going to hurt it. But since Saturn's Garvita proud, Mars, just in a natural friend sign, won't have enough strength to really starve Mars completely. But it'll hurt him. Then he's hurt by the Sun, he's hurt by Moon, helped by Mercury, helped by Venus. So this is a mixed Saturn. He's really strong himself. He gets helped by Venus and Mercury. Venus is exalted. But then he's hurt by the Sun and hurt by the Moon. And hurt by Mars by being conjunct to Mars. So this Saturn is struggling, but it has that exalted Venus making a strong aspect which can save him. Okay? So right away that should give you a hint of when's the likely time Saturn-Venus is going to, or Saturn-Dasha is going to give the right person. Good chance would be Saturn-Venus. Okay? So, but Saturn can do it, but not without an element of starvation and depression, because he does have Mars there and it was frustrating. So this person was actually in love with somebody who didn't care about them during a big part of Saturn Dasha. So there was that frustration of unrequited love, that Mars was starving Saturn and the Sun was starving Saturn. But unfortunately, Saturn had his friend Venus, and Venus is exalted. Venus is the seventh lord in the Saptamsha, and importantly, the fourth lord from Saturn in the Saptamsha, 1, 2, 3, 4. So Venus is like the perfect relationship-centered planet, and he's a friend to Saturn. So in Saturn-Venus, this person falls in love with somebody who also falls in love with them, and so they start a strong relationship. Okay? And so as it happens, and Navamsha would show this too, but as it happens, they got engaged in Saturn-Venus Dasha. So strong feelings of commitment and love coming quite quickly in Saturn-Venus between these people who, 4 months or so, engaged 4 months after meeting each other. Okay? And because it was such a nice planet that gave the relationship, this really nice Venus, that made for a really good long-term relationship. Venus in the chart is exalted, so he's proud, he's Garvita. He's hurt by the Moon a bit, but then helped by Mula Trikona Saturn. And then there's no bad conjunctions to Venus. There's no conjunctions to him. So this is a really proud and Garvita and Mudita delighted planet. It's a great Venus. So they meet someone that they're very, very happy with in the Antardasha of Venus. And you see the strong fourth house involvement. Saturn rules the fourth. The fourth lord from Saturn is Venus, but Venus is also the seventh lord. When you see the fourth house coming into place, then, especially in a woman's chart, then the relationship, one of the things about it is it really gives a person a place in the world. Okay? It gives them a place to live and so on. Traditionally, when we see the fourth house planet, and if that's the planet that gives marriage, it usually means more like a housewife type role or something like that, but something where the woman finds her place in the world as a result of her marriage. And that was the case with this person. The marriage very much gave her her place in the world. So that's a pretty good example here of Saturn-Venus and just the importance of the Saptamsha for indicating the times of meeting the important people in our lives that we're going to have relationships with. If the meeting planet is in great shape, if it's the strongest one to do that thing, that's very, very promising, okay, for making a good long-term relationship, okay? In this case, it was, okay? So use that Saptamsha to time your relationship activity, to time when somebody might meet somebody. And after they've met, to see how their productivity is, see how much they produce and do together, continue to study the Saptamsha. But when it comes to see when they're going to get married and commit legally and commit philosophically and spiritually with each other through marriage, at that point start focusing in on the Navamsha and look for when the Navamsha is going to tie that knot. Okay? Now in an arranged marriage, you would actually start with the Navamsha first, where they get married first, and then their relationship or their Saptamsha begins after marriage. But in the modern world, most people meet and then fall in love and then marry later. Usually you need to start actually with the Saptamsha, so you can't afford to neglect the Saptamsha. So also do look at the Navamsha for relationships too. So the next set of videos, we're going to start on the Navamsha now. That's our next Varga after the Saptamsha. So there'll be a lot more relationship stuff that we'll be looking at then. Okay, thank you.